Hi, I'm Christopher Walker with Closely Observed Teaching, and in this video we're going to take a little look at the three main suite exams. That's the B2 First for Schools, C1 Advanced and C2 Proficiency, and we're going to look at the speaking paper. So this video is intended for people who are teaching exam classes as ELT teachers or ELF teachers. So you'll have students who are starting to prepare for one of these exams, and you want to know a little bit more about what they will expect to find in the speaking paper. So I'll tell you about the structure of each of the papers. We'll look at an example of the sort of questions that the students will be asked, and I'll also talk about one or two things that might not be immediately obvious in terms of the approach that needs to be taken. Okay, so let's think about the room as the students enter, shall we? And to talk about my own context, I have a bit of experience as an examiner. I used to do speaking exams with Cambridge for B2 First and First for Schools, and the way that we usually had things set up was that the students would come in. There'd be a large table here and a little table here, and then we would have the two candidates. So we would have, let's call them candidate A and candidate B. Usually there would be two, and they would sit next to each other at the table. If there were three candidates, which sometimes happens if there's an odd number of students, or if one of the students who's registered for the exam doesn't turn up on the day, that would be the last of the session, basically. It's not ideal to have three candidates, but it happens, and it's accommodated in the exam. So facing the two candidates, we have one of the examiners, which is called, this person is called the interlocutor. If you break it down into the basics, inter would be between, locute is speak. So the interlocutor is the person who addresses the candidates. They talk to candidate A, they talk to candidate B, and they make sure that all the tasks are done and that they are done on time. The timing is very strict for Cambridge exams, and it's part of their drive to standardize the exams. So then over here we have the assessor. Okay, so the assessor's job is basically to grade the student's performance, to grade the candidates during the speaking paper. However, the interlocutor will give one of the grades, and this is called global awareness. I'm not going to be talking about grading and assessment in this video. This is just about the structure of the exams. But if you're interested in finding out more, I have some tips for you at the end of this video. Okay, so regardless of the level, B2, C1, C2, the candidates will enter. They will be invited to take a seat by the interlocutor. The interlocutor will ask for their mark sheets. They will turn and hand them to the assessor. They say hello. The interlocutor then says, first, I'd like to know your names, and you are. And they'll write the names down on a piece of paper. They write things down along with the start time, because in the heat of the moment, it's very easy to forget candidates' names. I know it happened to me that even, if the candidate had my name, if he was a Polish candidate called Krzysz, I'd still forget. So I had to write it down. So you get all these candidates coming through. The interlocutors will make a habit of writing the names down. Then they'll ask where they're from. Now, please don't prepare your students with a long spiel here. As an interlocutor or an assessor, I always hated it when I would say to a candidate, where are you from? And they would say, well, I come from the small Silesian city of Bielsko-Biała, which is an industrial center with a long history in the textile markets, or something like that. They'd prepared it. As soon as they'd told me where, I'd be like, thank you, and then I'd move on. Because these are standard questions. They hardly count. They're necessary for form and for politeness. You ask people where they're from, but you don't really care. So let's say you're teaching in Poland. Your students want to know, what do I say when they say, where are you from? You say, well, you're from Poland. That's it. Just wait for the next question. Okay, so once that's done, we go straight into the first part of the paper. So let me bring up an example to show you. Okay, so I'm taking this from a resource that I made that I have available for sale on the internet. There's a link in the description if you're interested in this sort of thing. I've put together 10 practice speaking tests for each of the 3 levels. The first part of the B2 first for schools is what we call the icebreaker. And here are some example questions. Now this part of the test lasts about 2 minutes. So generally what would happen is the interlocutor would ask a question to candidate A, then to B, maybe B again, and then A, and then they're done. Of course, if the candidates give longer answers than they're expecting and it eats into the 2 minutes, then maybe candidate A only gets 1 question and B gets 2. It depends on the candidates and how they answer. Importantly, the candidates don't see these questions. I'm showing them on the screen here so you get a feel for what kind of questions they are. Basically, the interlocutor will have a script to follow and the questions will be in different categories and they'll just pick and choose. They'll try not to repeat themselves too much going from one set to the next, but I really don't think that candidates leave the exam room in a hurry to go and tell the candidates in the waiting room, oh, we talked about likes and dislikes, and then the candidates in the waiting room are like, oh, great, that's giving me an advantage. Doesn't happen. So they're on general topics, personal opinions, and things like that. So it's a bit easy to get the students into. One of the things that you as a teacher can do, and this is true for all 3 of the levels, is to get students thinking about different ways of saying things. If you say, what do you like? The obvious structure to use would be, I like this. So teach them other ways, like, oh, football is something I like, or well, one of the things I quite like is football. You know, break it up so that it's not always I. Give them a little bit of variety in their toolkit. Okay, so like I said, this part, the icebreaker, lasts for about 2 minutes, and whilst this is happening, the assessor will be filling in the personal details and everything on the mark sheets. They will be listening, but they won't be paying full attention in the way that they will be with the later parts. So part 1 finished, part 2. And part 2 is what we call the individual long term. So the way this is structured then is candidate A gets 2 pictures and a question. Why might people want to visit these places in this case? They have 1 minute to talk about the 2 pictures, answering that question. At the end of that minute, candidate B is given a short response question, in this case, which place would you prefer to visit? Then they swap. Candidate B has their 1 minute, then candidate A has 30 seconds in which to respond. Now, one of the really important things that students need to know about before they go into the exam is that it's not really their job to describe the picture. Picture description comes up at B1 preliminary level. It's not at B2 and upwards. The pictures are there, the examiners can see them, they have their own copy. So describing them is kind of a waste of time. They've only got a minute. So what they need to be doing is speculating. Notice all the questions here are going to be speculative. Why do you think? Why might they have done this? Those sort of questions, okay? And that's what you want your students to be thinking about, not necessarily describing the pictures. Okay, so then candidate A has their short response question, and there we go. So the first 2 parts then, we've had about 2 minutes for part 1. We've had about 3 minutes, 3 and a bit, including the instructions for part 2. So far, the candidates have not talked to each other, and that's where it changes. And that's where it gets more complicated. Here we are then at part 3, which is the collaborative task. So the interlocutor introduces the context. They say, you're preparing for, you're thinking about learning a new language. Here are some things that people think about when they're about to learn a new language, and a question for you to discuss. First, you have some time to look at the task. So they get about 10-15 seconds. They've got the paper in front of them, candidate A, candidate B. They're looking at the task and they're starting to think. And then the interlocutor says, good, now talk together about what would be good and bad about these ways of learning a new language. And for this, they have 2 minutes. One thing you want to get your students to avoid is immediately using a superlative. Or lessons with the teacher, that's the best option, definitely. Because actually that's going to come up in about 2 minutes. What you want them to do is methodically go through each of the points, or as many as possible, in the 2 minutes and address the question. The question is, what would be good and bad? For example, lessons with a teacher, what would be good? Well, you get lots of feedback from the teacher. What would be bad? Well, it probably costs a lot more money than just reading a book in the other language. So they can balance those viewpoints. As a rule of thumb, I would say getting through 3 of the 5 points in those 2 minutes would be good to aim for. Okay, they don't need to get through all 5. If they get through all 5 in those 2 minutes and they've still got time left, it suggests that they haven't really gotten into the topic very well. So after those 2 minutes, the interlocutor says thank you, and then says, which of these ways do you think is the most effective way of learning a new language? Okay, so that question won't appear on the paper. I'm putting it up on the screen so you can see it. But the idea then is that the candidates have 1 minute to decide. So let's say that they've only talked about 2 of the things for whatever reason. Does that mean that they have to choose between those 2? No, they can use all 5 to make this decision. Do they have to agree? No. It's probably good if they work towards agreement, but they don't have to reach an agreement by the end of that minute. They could put forward their opinions. The other person could acknowledge the validity of the opinion and still go against it. It doesn't really matter. Remember, we're looking at evidence of English language. We're not looking at task completion per se. Okay, so that's the end of part 3. Note the topic, though. The topic here is about learning a new language. And as we enter part 4, which is the discussion, the topic is going to be the same carried over. So part 3 gets us into the topic, part 4 develops the topic. Again, the candidates won't be given these questions. I'm going to show them on the screen so that you can kind of follow through each of them. So let's say that in the collaborative task, candidate A talked and talked and talked, and B was too shy. Now the interlocutor will probably address the first question to B. They'll say, do you think it's easy or difficult to learn a new language? Candidate B, tell me what you think. And then they might say to A, and do you agree? Something like that. So these questions kind of diverge. They go from very specific to the task, then more generalized, more abstract, let's say. And this part of the test takes about 4 minutes. And at the end of it, we come to the end and we say, thank you, goodbye. So that was the B2 first for schools. And in terms of the total time available, we're looking at about 14 minutes. C1 Advanced is almost identical, except the students have 15 minutes, and C2 Proficiency we'll have to look at more in detail because it's quite different, and it has about 16 minutes of time available for the candidates. Okay, so we've got our structure for B2 first and first for schools. Icebreaker, individual long term, collaborative task, discussion. So let's see how that compares with the C1 Advanced, and we will find actually that it's pretty much the same. Right, so let's take a look at the C1 Advanced, and again I've got speaking test packs if you need them at your school. You can make your own, but you need to kind of think about it, think about the structure of the exam. You need to have some photos that you can use. So what's different? Well, part 1 is the same. I mean, the introduction is the same. Where are you from? That sort of thing. I think they ask, are you studying? Are you working at the moment? But these are not real questions. And then again, 2 minutes. So the timing is about the same. And they'll have a menu of questions and they'll choose 1 or 2 for each of the candidates. They will be slightly more difficult. Note that in the first one for B2 first, we were thinking about things like, what sport would you like to try? And here we've got something a lot more hypothetical, like what would your life be like if you lived in a different country? So there's a little bit more that's demanding there for the students. Okay, so 2 minutes for that. Then we go on to the individual long term. And again, it's a picture round. And again, describing the pictures is not the point. So this time there are 2 questions. There are 3 pictures, but the interlocutor specifies that the candidate should only talk about 2 of them. They don't have to say which 2. The pictures are there. They have a finger. They can just point. So for example here, why might people choose to travel in these vehicles? What might the problem be with this method of transport? I've noticed a little typo there, I need to change. So they could say, well, people might choose to travel in an aeroplane, pointing at this one, because they want to travel a long way. And then they're into it. So they need to cover both of those questions with 2 of the pictures. So let's do a quick bit of maths. You've got 4 things you need to talk about. You've got 60 seconds. So that gives you about 15 seconds per point. It's not long, is it? So in the stress of the exam environment, you might find that it's a bit of a struggle. So give your students plenty of time to talk about these things. And if they start describing the picture too much, get them away from that. Tell them the pictures are representative. There could have been a different picture, but that still showed an aeroplane. It doesn't matter, you're not describing the picture, you're describing or talking about the thing it represents. So at the end of that 1 minute, candidate B gets to do a short response. Which of these forms of transportation would you prefer to use? They can talk about any of the 3, not just the ones that candidate A talked about. Then they swap roles. Candidate B gets 3 pictures, talks about 2, has the 2 questions. Candidate A gets the short response, and you're done. So we're looking at the same sort of timing, really. And it continues then into part 3. Again, 2 minutes and 1 minute. So the interlocutor says, here are some things people think about doing before a test or exam. Look at the task, they get about 10 seconds. Now talk together, saying how useful it is to do these things before a test or exam. 2 minutes go by, the interlocutor says, thank you. Which of these things do you think people should spend the most time doing before a test or exam? Nice and simple. Okay, and then the task continues into the discussion. The difference here, though, is that the discussion lasts for 5 minutes. So the candidates get a little bit longer to talk through some of these questions. And again, the interlocutor is going to try and get a balance so that over parts 3 and 4, the collaborative parts of the exam, both of the candidates will have the opportunity to speak, hopefully more or less equally. Okay, so we've looked at B2 First for Schools, we've looked at C1 Advanced. We've seen that the 2 tests are broadly similar. There are some small differences between them, but what about C2 Proficiency? Well, it's quite different. So let me bring up an example for you. And here we go. So this is the C2 Proficiency speaking test pack that I've produced. The opening questions again, say, where are you from? Are you working or studying at the moment? And then the same sort of icebreaker questions. This part still, it's only 2 minutes, but now it's different. The next part's going to be different because next we've got the picture round, but this time it's a collaborative round. Okay, so the 4 pictures are put in front of the candidates and they're given the context that there's a magazine article on the topic of tourism, you're going to be working on it, and then the instruction will be given to talk about 2 of the pictures together for 1 minute. So the interlocutor would say, now look at pictures 2 and 4 and talk together about the different aspects of tourism the photos show. So this is kind of a renewed icebreaker in a way. It's getting them thinking about tourism, activating that lexis, and they can go in, what is it that the pictures represent? Again, remember, they don't want to describe the pictures necessarily, they want to talk about what the pictures mean. So they get about 1 minute for that, and then they're given 3 minutes for the real collaborative task. They talk about all 4 pictures now. They talk about the effects that tourism has on places popular with tourists in this example, and then decide which photo to use for an article on the theme of tourism. So there are 2 parts to it. This 3-minute round, if you think about it, it looks and feels very much like the collaborative task that we've just seen in B2 First for Schools, and C1 Advanced, except instead of the 5 topic sentences or expressions, we've now got 4 pictures. And instead of the interlocutor giving them 2 minutes and 1 minute, 2 to talk and 1 to decide, here they have to manage the time themselves. To be honest, this feels like it's ripe for a change. It could very easily be brought into sync with the other exams. We'll see if that happens in the future. So they get about 3 minutes for that, and at the end of that time, we move on. And we move on to the individual long turn, and this is properly a long turn. So instead of pictures, each candidate, when it's their turn, they get a card, prompt card. It's a very open prompt card. Who can help young people prepare for their future lives? Now, they don't have to talk about the 3 points that are given here. If they can talk for 2 minutes intelligibly in structured language answering this question, then fair game, do it. But these 3 points here are usually there to help guide the candidates, gives them a little bit more structure to play with so that they can get into it and they'll be able to do a better job. So they talk for about 2 minutes. The idea is that in those 2 minutes, they're basically trying to create a mini essay. So they need to introduce the topic. So here, for example, they could say, all young people must find a way to prepare for their future lives. However, they don't necessarily need to do that completely on their own. Help is at hand. One form of help, and that's the next paragraph, would be their parents. And then they can talk about how parents can help and whether it would be good or not for them to help. And then they go through each of those points. There probably won't be time for them to do a conclusion. They also don't really have the opportunity to keep track of the time itself very well. So after those 2 minutes, the interlocutor will say thank you. It's like, a sample part of an essay rather than an essay that you get time to craft. Then there's a kind of response. The interlocutor will have a couple of questions to choose from in their frame, in their script, and they can ask the other candidates one of these questions, and it kind of generates a mini discussion, and that lasts for about a minute. When that's done, second candidate gets their prompt card, they talk for 2 minutes, then there's the follow-up for a minute, and we're done. Then you'll notice that the 2 cards were on the same sort of overarching topic. Here we're talking about preparing for the future, and now we're back in line with what we've seen with the other papers, with the other levels. The last part is a longer discussion on that topic with the same sort of questions that we've met before. So this one then runs for 4 minutes. So let's just go back and recap what we've got. So we've looked at the structure of the room, what it's going to look like when the candidates come in. We've looked at the different parts of the exam, and we've seen that B2 and C1 share a lot in common, C2 slightly less so, but when you start digging a bit deeper, you can start to see some similarities. Now, one of the weirdest things about all of this, probably the strangest thing I want to say, is that actually the individual long turn in C2 proficiency can prove more manageable for a lot of students than the individual long turn at any of the other levels. Yeah, I know, it's 2 minutes. Telling someone to talk for 2 minutes uninterrupted is horrible. But when you get into the topic, it's easier to talk for 2 minutes than it is to try and squeeze in 4 points of content in 1 minute like you do in the C1 Advanced. So it's interesting how that sort of thing works. Okay, and then last thing I want to show you very briefly is my online shop. This is on shoptly.com/closely observed, and I'll put a link in the description below. The things that you might be interested in, I've got the speaking practice test bundle, the 3 levels just here, 10 speaking packs for each one, so you can practice with your students. And then I've also got this, which might be of interest to you. This is the Closely Observed Book of Exam Preparation. And this basically goes through every part of every exam in detail, talking about how it all works. So this is a PDF. It also has listening files, so you can do a practice listening test with your students, and that's also available. So everything that you can see here, it's all available for purchase if you've got a PayPal account. And well, that's it. Does anybody have any questions? If so, please get in touch. Write a comment in the box below. I'd be very happy to help where I can. And that's it. Thank you very much, and see you next time.